And so that if you think about that intellectual demand as putting it all into action, we might think about, the factors that, the characteristics and those factors as a child or as an adolescent that influence or cause or at least correlate with adult socioeconomic status. So I put cause, influence, predict, correlate with, because I think that when we're talking about the evidence, there's a real mixing of these things. The idea that if something correlates, then it must be causative. And I think there's lots and lots of kind of difficulty and confusion in that space. People talk about predicting that this aspect of children predicts this later on. But all they're saying is that there's a correlation between the two. They're not actually saying necessarily that what goes on as a child, in early childhood, actually causes something later, some characteristic as a learner later on in school or later on in adulthood. And so we might have in our minds some of the ideas about, what it is that predicts an adult's socioeconomic status. What is it that kids get from their education that changes that's got the capability of changing their socioeconomic status, that actually not just correlates with, but causes a shift in their socioeconomic status? Well, one of the studies that's really had an impact on my thinking was this study that came out in 2011 from a study in Dunedin in New Zealand. And what they did was they followed 1,000 kids. They took 1,000 kids from birth and took measurements of the level of self-control, their cognition, their stop and think skills. They took measures of their IQ and measures of their socioeconomic status. And they followed these kids through into adolescence and took some measures of things like smoking, leaving school without any qualifications, and unwanted teenage pregnancies. And then carried on and took measurements in adulthood, a whole host of things around their health, their wealth, and their crime levels. And you can see that they still had 972 people in the study when they were 32 years old. The results of this were published, as I said, in 2011, and these are some of the tables from the original research paper. What they found was that there was no correlation between the socioeconomic status of the children and any of these outcomes that I'm going to show you about health, about wealth, about their socioeconomic status as an adult. And that can't be true, right? Because we know that socioeconomic status runs in families. It goes from one generation to the next through families. So that can't be true. But what they did in this study was they controlled for the level of cognition. They controlled for the level of these stop and think skills. And when you control for those level of stop and think skills, that's where the impact of socioeconomic status goes away. Because what we find is that the kids from low socioeconomic status backgrounds tend to have low levels of stop and think skills. And the kids from higher socioeconomic status backgrounds tend to have higher levels of stop and think skills. But if you find the kids from the low socioeconomic status backgrounds who've got the higher level of stop and think skills, their outcomes are much better. And if you find the kids from the higher socioeconomic status who've got the low level of these stop and think skills, their outcomes are poorer. So the agent for intergenerational socioeconomic status is largely the student's cognition, is largely their ability to do these stop and think skills, and I'll unpack these skills in a second. Let me show you what I mean. Let's get into it. What they did was they took the kids and they split them into 5 equally populated groups. The first group, number 1, had the lowest level of these self-control skills, these stop and think skills. The second group had the next level, the third group had the next highest level, and so on. And what they found was, this is a measure of, the green line there is a measure of poor physical health. So what we're seeing is, as adults, that the kids who had the lowest level of stop and think skills as children, when they became adults, they had the poorest health outcomes. Add a little bit of childhood stop and think skills, a bit of childhood cognition, and you get better health outcomes. Add a bit more stop and think skills as a child, better health outcomes, and so on. So there's a relationship between the two. The red line that you can see there is substance dependence. The same sort of relationship. This is the adult criminal conviction rate. So you can see again that the kids who had the lowest level of stop and think skills had the highest level of adult criminal convictions, more than 40%. And that goes down and down and down as we have these stop and think skills until at the highest level it's down in the low teens. Leaving school without any educational qualifications, the same sort of relationship. So it's not about this kid's socioeconomic status. It's about the level of these stop and think skills that's making all the difference. There's no correlation between socioeconomic status on its own when you correct for these stop and think skills on leaving school without any qualifications. And this is a bit of a mess because I took it from the original research paper. But just let's pick some things out. Hopefully you can see that pale blue line that starts here, goes up to here, here, here. That's income. This is a correlation between your childhood level of stop and think skills, your childhood level of cognition, and your income as an adult. The dark blue line is socioeconomic status. So we're really starting to see that agent for socioeconomic status, that agent for all these broader outcomes for young people, is mediated by the cognition, by this higher level of cognition, rather than necessarily mediated by things like socioeconomic status per se. I think I'm really worried about some of the economic arguments and some of the things that economists and policymakers are saying about kids from low socioeconomic status, or even making assumptions about kids from higher socioeconomic status backgrounds, because those assumptions are really limiting assumptions. They're not getting down to the core. They're seeing correlations that are not causative. And we don't necessarily know that this correlation is causative, except that what these researchers did was they had 1,000 kids, and what they saw was that for some reason, though they didn't go and do any intervention, but for some reason, some kids shifted in terms of their level of stop and think skills. So during later on in childhood or during adolescence, they shifted their level of stop and think skills. And their outcomes were predicted by where they ended up in terms of those cognitive skills, not where they started out. So the early years are important, and and that message we're getting loud and clear, and I don't think anybody's doubting that. But what we're also seeing is childhood's important as well, and adolescence is important as well, and that there's opportunity upon opportunity upon opportunity for us as educators to raise student cognition, to improve students' levels of these stop and think skills. And if we do that, if we raise their cognition, raise their ability to respond to that intellectual demand, we see that their outcomes will improve across a whole host of things, not just their educational outcomes.